Hello, Pastor Will here for Sunday, August 29th, 2021. Our message today comes out of James chapter 1 and Mark chapter 7. We want to remember in prayer today the Bond family as they're still dealing with some illnesses, the continued plague because people are putting their rights ahead of other people's rights, and Hurricane Ida barreling toward Louisiana. Let's remember them. It will be interesting to see how the poor are treated again this time and how the church will respond to that. All right, we're going to look at James, the book of James. Who is the author of the book of James? Well, traditionally, the author is Jesus' brother, James. We're told in 1 Corinthians that Jesus' brother, James, became an apostle after seeing the risen Jesus. That convinced him that, my brother might be something more than I really thought. That must be incredibly difficult. I know that my brothers struggle with that with me and realizing how wonderful I am, and they just don't seem to understand it. But anyway, what kind of person was James? Well, one of the early church historians tells us that James was totally devoted to God, and he was a man of intense prayer, praying for the people of the world. And he was in prayer so much that his knees were calloused like those of a camel because of his kneeling down in devotion to God and praying for the people. We also know that James was martyred. We have two extra biblical sources that tell us this. One is the Antiquities by Josephus. He tells us that James was martyred. And then, of course, in the history of the church, we're told that James was taken to the pinnacle of the temple by the high priest, and he was expected to deny Jesus when he got up there or be hurled to his death. And instead of denying Jesus, James confesses who Jesus is, and for that he's hurled off the pinnacle of the temple. He crashes down to the ground where he's expected it will kill him, but it doesn't kill him, but he can't get up, and he's laying down there dying. And while he's down there on the ground, all broken up, he prays for his enemies who are killing him. And of course, this outrages them, his enemies, and they stone James, and then they club him to death. So that's James, a man who truly practiced what he preached. And I say that because in the book of James, when it does talk about Jesus, it mostly talks about Jesus in the same terms that we see Jesus in the book of Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. And it was in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So that's James. We can see that for James, in the book of James, devotion to God is expressed in practical terms and aren't simply empty phrases of piety. So, tradition may hold, tradition may hold that the writer of James is the brother of Jesus, but we really don't know that, and scholars kind of doubt that it really was him because James, the brother of Jesus, was a Galilean raised by a craftsman. And the writer of the book of James was a highly educated Greek speaker, which is totally different from a Galilean. And we know Jesus himself and his brothers spoke Aramaic. So it's not likely that is actually the brother of Jesus, but we sure love that tradition. And the texts today are about our love for tradition and how our love for tradition often gets in the way of our being followers of God. So that's why I bring that up. Basically, scholars believe that based on the evidence, the writer of James was a Greek-speaking Jewish Christian. The one thing that we do know about the writer of James is that he or she emphasizes the necessity of deeds as the logical outcome of faith. Deeds, doing things, acting a certain way, practicing faith instead of just saying, I have faith. This means one cannot simply say they have faith in Jesus or just give an intellectual assent to faith without backing up that faith with actual deeds, especially if we expect to experience salvation. without the actual deeds of the teachings of Jesus, then we don't know Jesus. It doesn't matter how faithful we think we are. It doesn't matter how many times we go to church, how many times we memorize Bible verses. None of that matters if we're not about the dirty task of loving our neighbors next door to us and our neighbors across the world. If we're not practicing that and instead are living by some tradition, any other tradition, whether it's a religious tradition or a nationalistic tradition, whatever it is, if we're living by that tradition, then that's what we worship and not God. So in James 1, verses 22 through 27, we're told that the followers of Jesus are doers of the word and not merely hearers. And so disciples of Jesus practice what they hear or practice what they preach even. We're not allowed to practice what we preach if it gets in the way of tradition. I remember once being on the way to go preach somewhere for a Sunday service and seeing a family in need on the side of the road, and I knew that if I stopped to help them, there would be very likely that I would miss preaching. But I did stop and help them, and I did miss preaching, and I got in huge trouble by the church for it. How dare you stop and help people when we were all waiting on you to come preach? In the first chapter of James, we're told that if we are seeking perfection in our relationship with God, our only hope of reaching such a state, the only way to truly be pious or to be holy, is to practice the teachings of God and Jesus, specifically Jesus' teaching that those who follow him care for society's lowliest inhabitants. Lowliest. True piety cares for the lowly in society. In biblical times, this was demonstrated as the orphans and the widows in society because these people had no power. None. The orphans and the widows represented society's most powerless, most vulnerable people. And the mark of a person who truly worships God was whether or not they were helping and meeting the needs of these most powerless and in many neglected and in many cases despised people. The Old Testament is full of prophets and other teachers reminding Israel that their calling as the people of God is not some ritualistic practice, but caring for society's most powerless people. That's the measure of whether or not you worship God. That's the measure of whether or not you take God seriously. That's the measure of whether or not your life is oriented in all ways toward the way of God. It doesn't matter if you go to church. If that is missing, you don't know God. Who are the most powerless in our society today? Well, a big hot button that I mention from time to time, even though I try not to, but that's our calling, is the refugees all over the world. More refugees now in the world than have ever been. And these are people who are trying to escape the dangers of their homeland in the hopes of finding a safe place for them and their families. They are powerless. We easily turn them away at our borders. Go away. Oh, we'll steal your children first, and then you can go away. You know, why wouldn't we steal their children? We can induct them into the military later because they really don't matter for anybody. They can just be sent off to be slaughtered. The poor and the destitute in our society, they're powerless. If you don't have money in this society, you don't count for anything. I remember when I used to have a lot of money and how differently I was treated in different places, government agencies, public enterprises, even private sector. I was treated very well. I really didn't have to ever wait on anything. I had many great privileges just because I had money. And then I compare that to when I was homeless, in which I was completely powerless. I was completely at the mercy of other people, and that mercy was very rare. The undereducated in our society, they don't have as much power as the educated. Those who are mentally ill to the point that it incapacitates them, they're the powerless. We regard them as Looney Tunes or deranged, and we treat them quite poorly. The danger that James is addressing is the very issue that Jesus constantly and consistently warns about during his days walking around. We see an example of this in today's gospel lesson from Mark 7. There were some pious and religious people. They were called the Pharisees. They noticed that Jesus' disciples are eating, but they didn't wash their hands before they ate. And they criticized them for it. And by criticizing the disciples, they're criticizing Jesus and his leadership. They're saying, Jesus, if you were all that, you would know that they need to wash their hands because that's their tradition of the elders. And so they're calling Jesus to task, putting him down. And how does Jesus react to these accusations? Well, he reacts by accusing his accusers of being hypocrites who teach human precepts or human traditions as the standard of living rather than the teachings of God. He says, you're so worried about whether or not they're washing their hands, whether or not they're clean on the outside, and give no regard to how clean they are on the inside. Jesus points out these things to them, and he cites several scriptures that point out the fallacy of their teaching, and that identifies them, the accusers, as false teachers. I can think of so many religious congregations, religious organizations of which I've been a part or in some way that are just full of these false teachings, of false teachings. The idea that if we are religious enough, then we know who God is. When usually if we just seek religion for religion's sake, we have no idea who God is, and we certainly don't serve God. I remember once when I was in grad school in Atlanta, and I decided to try and experiment and see how it would be treated, not knowing how prescient this was, that one day I would be homeless. I decided to act like I was homeless on the streets of Atlanta for a few days and see how I was treated. And that was quite the eye-opening experience, especially when I noticed that the campus of First Baptist Church Atlanta, where Charles Stanley was pastor, had a beautiful tree on its lawn that offered great shade, and it was very hot. And so I and my companions got under the tree, in the shade of the tree, to have some respite from the heat of the day. And we just laid back, and within, maybe 3 minutes, these two burly security guards came from within the church building, First Baptist, and demanded that we leave immediately or we would be thrown off the campus. And I tried to reason with them with the teachings of Jesus and caring for the powerless and caring for the poor and all this. And they laughed at me and grabbed me under my shoulders and bodily threw me onto the street. Good lesson. No care for the poor. No care for the teachings of God. I'm reminded of another tradition. I was in a town where I was a pastor. It was a small town. And one day a woman came to me, a group of people came out of the church building after a sermon and said, there's a young man who's moved to town and he has AIDS, and you need to go see him. And you need to invite him to leave the town because he doesn't belong here. There's obviously something wrong with him. Real compassionate people coming out of the worship of God. Let's kick this person away. I'm reminded of another congregation where I was, and I had received help from a man who was a local drug dealer. He was quite wealthy, and he had gotten out of the drug dealing business, and he had served his time, but he was still wealthy. And I had asked him for some help. I was broken down, and he gave me a ride home. He was very kind. Not only did he give me a ride home, but I interrupted a party he was having to ask for help, and he still left the party and took me. And he and I ended up becoming friends. And the church where I was pastor at that time condemned my friendship with him, even though this man did more in the community to help others than the church who spewed false piety had ever even considered. In fact, that church ended up throwing out several people, throwing them on the ground because they didn't like them, because they weren't like the church, the majority of the church people. In my first church I went to, this is kind of funny, I showed up, I had a Jeep Wrangler and a motorcycle, a Ninja. And they told me, you can't drive those vehicles. Those are not very preacher-like. And I said, what kind of car will a preacher drive? Certainly not a Cadillac. They all had Cadillacs parked all around him. And they said, well, you just can't be seen in the motorcycle or the Jeep. You're going to have to get rid of them. I didn't. Local churches love our traditions, especially during the high holy days of the year. We love Christmas and Easter and all our great traditions, while we ignore the poor and the destitute and the hopeless. We love our great American traditions that tell us that we're number one and we're the best and we're doing everything right. And refugees from other countries obviously aren't loved by God, which is illogical if you're a Christian, because it's with the destitute and the hopeless and the poorest of the poor that God favors and is hanging out with, not with the well-to-do in the churches. One of the greatest traditions of the church in the U.S. of A. is the idea of family values being about a societal understanding of family, rather than Jesus' understanding of family, which is that family is those who do the will of God. His family, that is. Jesus' family are those who do the will of God, those who serve others in need. And who are these others? Well, they're people in need, but they're the lowest of the low. We're commanded to love the loveless. And the only way that Jesus defines family values is by our doing the will of God, by loving the loveless. And yet, so many traditions of the churches condemn those who they refuse to love. That's a tradition that is worshipped instead of worshiping God. It's hypocrisy at its finest. To help those in need is the highest form of piety, not religious practice. How many churches do you know who throw people out, who have a history of throwing people out of their midst because of their color or their belief system or whatever? Throw them out. We're better than they are. They don't belong here. Oh, how Jesus weeps. To be a Christian, to be a disciple of Jesus, to be saved, if you will, is to spend our lives caring for those whom society has thrown away or is diligently ignoring or persecuting if they can't get rid of them fast enough. How is the church marching in the streets to bring in the homeless into our buildings that are used once or twice a week? How is the church marching in the streets and going to our legislators and writing letters to our legislators and calling our legislators, which, by the way, I do these things about 3 or 4 times a week. I forgot to mention that last week. You know, people are like, we don't need to just hear what's wrong. We need to know how to change things. That's how you change things. You're the squeaky wheel. You're the loudmouth. You're the one saying this is wrong. This is a sin. This is a crime against humanity. It's a crime against humanity that we even have any homeless people. It's a crime against humanity that we don't have universal health care. And the church is silent. Silent while we celebrate Christmas with a great gusto and all the traditions that come with it. How many churches do you know who are full of the thrown away? How many churches do you know who spend as much money on those suffering in society as they do on their beautiful church buildings and programming for themselves? Look at your church budget, your typical church budget. We have just a little tiny part for missions or outreach, as if that's an option or an add-along. It's the only point of the church. That's it. But we've made it a tradition that it's just a part of what we're really about, because we're really self-serving. We would rather give our attention to matters of what we consider to be pious instead of what God considers as pious. We would rather give our attention to how we dress or going to church or memorizing scripture or judging others than investing our lives and our money in what God says really matters, and that's people, hurting people, harmed people, lonely people, suffering people, lonely people, despised people. Some years ago, I had some church members come to me and say, Pastor, we need a revival. The church needs a revival. And I said, okay, all right. What kind of revival? What are you talking about? Our old time religion revival. We get together and we meet and we have revival. That's what we need. And I said, you know what? You're absolutely correct. We do need revival. I'll tell you what, I'll plan a revival for a week and a couple of months. How's that? Oh, yeah, that's what we need. So then the church, was getting pumped up about it. We're going to have revival. Yes. And I talked to several pastors I knew and invited each of them to come on a different night and told them what I was up to and what I hoped to see in this revival. And they all agreed and said they'd be there. And I communicated this to the church. We got all these different pastors coming, and they've all got a great message to share. And the first night of our revival was a Sunday night, and everybody came so excited for revival. I introduced our first guest pastor that night, and he said a few words. We sang some songs, and then, after maybe 15, 20 minutes had gone by, and it was time for the main event, revival. And I wheeled out some rakes and shovels and hoes and work gloves and wheelbarrows and different things, paint brushes and paint. And I said, people, we've got a whole week of helping people in this community lined up, people with real needs, and we can do things. And also, just people who need to have a visitor to see them because they're lonely. And so let's get ready, come up and look at the list of what you can do and get what implements you need. And you can see the list for the whole week and know what to bring next time as well. And we're going to go out and we're going to be the church in this community and be revived. And everybody got mad and went home. We'd rather serve tradition that is safe and keeps us clean and doesn't allow our hands to get dirty than to dare to mingle with the smelly and the dirty and hang out with God and be revived. It's much easier to play being the church and convince ourselves that we're pious, good people than to risk getting our hands dirty to actually love people in the name of God. And like the Pharisees who accused Jesus and his disciples of having dirty hands, in our efforts to keep our hands clean, we reveal what dirty black hearts we have. We aren't called to serve ourselves. We aren't called to keep a tradition. If anything, Jesus blew tradition wide open. Jesus came to say the tradition's not working. You need to care about people who nobody cares about. We are called to allow our hearts to be transformed so that when people see us, they see the very face of God and they know they're beloved. In Christ's name.